In the heart of ancient Greece, beneath the shimmering marble of Delphi, a secret was buried, one that would stain the name of Apollo himself. For centuries, pilgrims believed the oracle's voice was divine. But what if those sacred words were born not from a god, but from suffering? What if the prophecies that shaped empires were spoken by women, drugged, violated, and silenced in the name of faith? Tonight, we uncover the horrifying truth history tried to erase: the sexual corruption of the Oracle of Delphi. In the time before Christ, Delphi was the beating heart of prophecy, the sacred navel of the world. Here, on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, the temple of Apollo shimmered in the sun like the seat of gods. But beneath its perfection, beneath the carved marble columns and gilded offerings, the earth breathed secrets through the fissures of stone. It was said that vapors rose from the ground, carrying the divine voice of Apollo himself. Yet what those vapors truly concealed was the first whisper of corruption, the slow birth of a system that would enslave faith to power. The ancient Greeks believed that the Pythia, the oracle, spoke for the god of light and truth. Her words could crown kings, start wars, or end them. From Persia to Sparta, no ruler dared act without her counsel. But few questioned how her words were chosen, or who controlled the mouth that spoke them. The priests of Delphi stood in the shadows, shaping destiny like sculptors molding wax, and the oracle herself became their instrument. The story began with devotion. The earliest oracles were said to enter trances willingly, inhaling the sacred fumes that drifted from the temple's crypt. Their bodies convulsed, their voices trembled, and the priests interpreted their speech as the language of the divine. But as Delphi's fame grew, so did its wealth, and where gold gathers, corruption follows. The sanctuary became a political machine, a place where prophecy was bought, sold, and manipulated to serve the ambitions of men. Historical fragments hint that the divine vapors may have been real, geological emissions of ethylene, capable of inducing hallucinations. Yet ancient sources also describe the oracle being prepared before each trance. Starved, isolated, and made to drink a mysterious brew. Her mind weakened, her will surrendered. By the time she sat upon Apollo's tripod, she was no longer a vessel of her own spirit, but of those who owned her. Behind every prophecy stood the council of priests, the unseen architects of truth. They alone entered the inner chamber, claiming to interpret the god's will. The oracle's words were transcribed, altered, and sometimes entirely rewritten before they were presented to waiting pilgrims. The system's brilliance lay in its illusion. The people believed they were hearing Apollo, when in truth they were hearing the ambitions of mortals. And yet, perhaps the most horrifying truth is that the oracle herself believed. Many were taken as young girls, raised within temple walls, told from childhood they were chosen by a god. They were taught obedience as holiness, silence as purity. To question the ritual was blasphemy. To resist the priests was madness. Their faith became the very chain that bound them. The temple echoed with hymns of devotion, but below, where the air grew heavy and damp, the line between prophecy and imprisonment blurred. There, the oracle was seated above the fissure, her mind unraveling in the sacred haze, her trembling voice echoing words she did not understand. And when her trance ended, the priests led her away, whispering that Apollo had spoken through her. But in the dark corners of the sanctuary, another whisper grew, that what rose from the depths was not the god's breath, but the stench of human deceit. The oracle's voice, once believed to be pure, had become the perfect mask for corruption. And as the centuries passed, the temple's marble floors drank the footsteps of those who came seeking truth, never realizing that the god they prayed to had long been replaced by men. To serve Apollo was to surrender everything. Each new oracle was chosen while still a child, taken from her home under the guise of divine honor. Her parents were promised eternal glory. The girl was promised eternity in the god's light. In truth, She was being delivered into a life of sacred captivity. Before she could speak for Apollo, she was stripped of her name, her family, and her past. The temple elders called it purification. She would live behind marble walls, isolated from the world, taught that her body was no longer her own, but the vessel of a god. In Delphi, virtue was measured not by freedom, but by obedience. The first rite was the oath of chastity. The child stood before the priests, draped in white linen, while the sacred flame burned behind her. She swore to remain untouched by mortal hands, to dedicate her life and flesh to Apollo alone. The ritual seemed holy until the years revealed what that oath truly meant. It gave the priesthood total power over her existence. Every aspect of her being, from when she could eat to how she would breathe during ceremony, was dictated by men who claimed to interpret the will of heaven. Historical fragments hint at the contradictions within this sanctity. The oracle's supposed purity was paraded before visiting dignitaries, yet the same priests controlled her isolation, deciding who might enter her chamber and when. Some scholars suggest that testing the purity became a secret custom, a procedure veiled in incense and prayer, but steeped in humiliation. The priests called it devotion. The victims called it silence. To maintain the illusion of holiness, each oracle was taught to see suffering as sacred. The less she resisted, the closer she was said to be to the god. Pain became proof of faith. When an oracle broke down, trembling or delirious, her weakness was recorded as ecstasy. The priests transcribed her distress as revelation. The sanctuary's grandeur, the gold, the laurel crowns, the hymns disguised a machinery that consumed human innocence and sold it as prophecy. Outside the temple, the Greek world worshipped the oracle's purity. Artists sculpted her image in marble, serene, eyes closed, lips parted as if whispering the secrets of gods. None of those artists knew the cell behind the statue, the cold stone floor where the chosen women slept. They were not allowed to touch sunlight without permission. The air that surrounded them was perfumed with myrrh to hide the stench of confinement. The corruption did not arise from lust alone, but from the politics of control. The oracle's purity was a symbol, a weapon used to prove the temple's moral superiority over rival sanctuaries. Each girl's chastity represented Delphi's divine legitimacy. If she faltered, the entire faith trembled. The priests therefore enforced obedience with threats of divine punishment. A whisper of rebellion could condemn her as possessed by an evil spirit, fit only for ritual cleansing, a fate from which few returned. Through the centuries, Delphi's worshippers never questioned how the same men who claimed to protect the oracle's sanctity also dictated her every movement. They saw only a sacred virgin wrapped in laurel and linen, never the frightened soul beneath the veil. In public, the priests bowed before her as the voice of Apollo. In private, they reminded her that without them, her voice would never be heard at all. The virgin's oath was not merely a vow of purity, it was the architecture of control, a spiritual contract written in fear. Beneath the hymns and offerings, it turned faith into possession. The oracle's holiness became a currency, her suffering the temple's most valuable secret. By the time she spoke her first prophecy, her words were no longer her own. And so, the oracle's divinity began where her freedom ended. The God she served was silent. The voices that guided her belonged to men. What the world revered as sacred chastity was, in truth, the purest form of corruption, a holiness constructed from human despair. Beneath the temple's polished marble floor lay a hidden room known only to the initiated, a narrow stone chamber where the god was said to speak. The Greeks called it the Adyton, the place no mortal should enter. Yet it was here that the oracle's transformation took place, where faith and fear dissolved into one suffocating mist. Ancient accounts describe the oracle seated upon a three-legged tripod, inhaling the sacred vapors that rose from a cleft in the earth. Those who stood above the chamber heard her moans echo through the stone, believing they were listening to Apollo himself. But what they truly heard was a woman drowning in fumes and terror. The priests claimed she was possessed by divine ecstasy. In truth, she was being consumed by a ritual designed to break her mind. Modern scholars have found traces of ethylene gas beneath the ruins of Delphi, substances capable of inducing trance, confusion, and hallucination. Yet the natural gases alone cannot explain the darkness described in ancient sources. Witnesses spoke of disorientation, violent trembling, and cries that turned into incoherent laughter. It was not only vapors that clouded the oracle's thoughts, but the deliberate preparation she underwent before entering the chamber. For days, she was kept in silence, deprived of rest and food, her body purified with herbs that dulled the senses. Then came the sacred drink, a mixture of laurel and barley wine. Some called it a potion of inspiration. Others, more truthfully, called it submission. By the time she descended into the Adyton, her mind floated between wakefulness and delirium. The chamber itself was suffocating. Torches burned low, filling the air with thick smoke. The heat from the fissure twisted the air into waves, and the stones beneath her feet pulsed with the earth's breath. To the priests, it was holy ground. To the oracle, it was a tomb she entered alive. Her body shivered uncontrollably as the fumes rose higher. Each breath tore at her lungs. Her voice, once human, began to distort. From the shadows above, the priests listened. When her words became frantic, they leaned closer, capturing fragments of her delirium and weaving them into prophecy. Whatever she muttered in confusion could be reshaped into divine command. Kings and generals would later bow before those words, never realizing they had been born from panic and pain. In the moments of her trance, the oracle's identity dissolved completely. She no longer remembered her name, her home, or the oath she had sworn. The voice that escaped her lips was not her own. It was the voice the priests demanded. Her body, trembling and drenched in sweat, became a symbol of transcendence for those above. They saw the shaking as proof that Apollo's spirit had entered her. None of them asked how much of that trembling came from fear. When the ritual ended, she was carried out, half-conscious, her skin pale as marble. The priests surrounded her, reciting prayers to mask what had truly taken place. To the people waiting outside, they proclaimed that the god had spoken once again through his holy vessel. Offerings were brought, coins clattered across the floor, and the temple's wealth grew heavier. Yet deep below, the chamber of vapors remained warm, still exhaling the same poison. Each new oracle would descend, believing she was entering the divine realm, and each would leave emptier than before. Over time, the fisher's breath became the heartbeat of Delphi, an invisible reminder that the god's wisdom was drawn from the suffering of mortals. What the world celebrated as revelation was, in truth, the perfection of control. The oracle's words guided nations, but her voice came from a pit in the earth. In that suffocating darkness, divinity and cruelty became one, and the air itself whispered a single truth. The gods of man are fed by the pain of their servants. Behind every prophecy that shook the ancient world stood a circle of men whose faces history rarely recorded. They called themselves the Hosioi, the Holy Ones, keepers of Apollo's sacred word. But holiness was only their mask. In truth, these were the architects of Delphi's deception, priests, financiers, and politicians who learned to turn faith into empire. The oracle to them was both a tool and a shield. Her frail voice carried the weight of divine command, yet the words she spoke were not hers to choose. The priests who managed the temple decided what each prophecy would say long before the oracle inhaled the sacred fumes. Her trance, her trembling, her broken speech, these became convenient performances to lend their manipulations divine legitimacy. Centuries of reverence had made Delphi the heart of Greece's spiritual authority. Kings, generals, and city-states came bearing gold and sacrifices, desperate for Apollo's favor. The men of the temple saw opportunity. The more powerful the petitioner, the more costly the prophecy. A favorable omen could shift the course of a war. A single sentence from the oracle could alter the fate of entire nations. Beneath the hymns and incense, Delphi had become a marketplace where truth was auctioned to the highest bidder. The priest's control extended beyond the words of prophecy. They dictated who might approach the oracle, what questions could be asked, and which answers would be divinely inspired. They even recorded the prophecies themselves, ensuring no one else could verify them. To the people, these men appeared as guardians of the god's will. But among themselves, they spoke openly of politics, alliances, and profit. The temple was their throne, and the oracle their crown. Behind closed doors, the priesthood functioned like a secret government. Envoys from Athens, Sparta, or Thebes would arrive bearing offerings, not as gifts to Apollo, but as payments to his servants. A discreet favor here, a subtle curse there, and the entire Greek world could be swayed through a few carefully chosen words. The oracle became the ultimate political weapon, her purity the perfect disguise for human corruption. Some ancient writers hinted at darker forms of control. They spoke of private rituals used to ensure the oracle's obedience. When her trances grew too wild, she was restrained. When her faith wavered, she was isolated until her will broke. The priests called these acts necessary purifications. To those who saw through the illusion, they were something else entirely, a sacred theater built upon the suffering of women. The greatest irony was that the oracle herself believed she served the divine. The priests convinced her that every humiliation was a test from Apollo, that submission proved holiness. They transformed exploitation into ritual, cloaking cruelty in gold and laurel. The system thrived not because it was hidden, but because it was sanctified. And yet, cracks began to show. A few travelers and philosophers questioned the priests' motives. They noticed that prophecies often favored whoever paid the most generous tribute. They whispered that Delphi's god no longer spoke truth, that his voice had been bought. But such doubts rarely spread far. The temple's influence was too vast, its wealth too deep, and its defenders too powerful. By the time the 5th century dawned, Delphi's priesthood ruled as silently as any king. Their authority extended beyond the temple walls, shaping alliances, wars, and the myths that justified them. The oracle's trembling voice, carried by rumor and reverence, became the perfect weapon, one that left no blood on the priest's hands. They called themselves servants of Apollo, but in truth, they served only themselves. Through the mouth of one frightened woman, they spoke the words that kept an empire on its knees. And as each prophecy echoed across Greece, the marble temple of Delphi stood gleaming, a monument not to divine wisdom, but to the triumph of corruption disguised as faith. Every prophecy at Delphi began not with prayer, but with a ritual the priests called purification. It was meant to cleanse the oracle of mortal imperfection, to prepare her body to receive the god. To the faithful, it symbolized divine renewal. To those who saw behind the veil, it was a ceremony of control, performed as much to remind the oracle of her subjugation as to honor Apollo. At dawn, the chosen woman was led to the sacred spring of Castalia, her bare feet pressed against the cold stone path that wound through the olive groves. The air smelled of laurel and smoke. Priests followed in silence, their robes heavy with incense, their eyes fixed not on heaven but on her. Before she could speak for Apollo, her body had to be made pure, a word that in Delphi carried meanings both holy and cruel. The oracle knelt by the spring as attendants poured cold water over her shoulders. They recited hymns that praised the god's light, but washed away her humanity. The ritual was slow, deliberate, meant to erase every trace of the woman she had once been. By the time she returned to the temple, shivering beneath white linen, she no longer felt real. She had become a symbol, a vessel to be filled, emptied, and filled again. Inside the temple, purification continued with offerings of myrrh and wine. The air thickened with smoke until breathing became a prayer. The priests anointed her with oil, their hands tracing ancient symbols across her arms and forehead, reciting that no mortal touch could defile her. Yet each gesture reminded her that she belonged to them. They called it sanctity. It felt like possession. This rite was not merely preparation, it was indoctrination. The oracle's body was used to demonstrate the temple's authority, a living proof that holiness demanded submission. The more she obeyed, the purer she appeared. The purer she appeared, the stronger the priest's power became. Even the smallest tremor of hesitation was interpreted as spiritual weakness, a flaw that required deeper cleansing. Visitors never saw this part of Delphi. They saw only the result, a woman crowned with laurel, radiant and calm, seated above the fissure as the god's chosen mouth. None imagined the hours of ritual that preceded the prophecy, or the tears hidden behind the hymns. To the world, the oracle was divine perfection. Within the temple, she was a trembling soul wrapped in white linen, purified until nothing human remained. The ritual of purification endured for centuries, its cruelty sanctified by repetition. It gave Delphi its aura of holiness while concealing the truth of what that holiness required. For each prophecy that shook the ancient world, a single woman first had to surrender everything that made her free. In the marble silence of Apollo's temple, purity was not innocence, it was obedience sculpted into ritual form. And as the priests raised their hands in prayer, the oracle stood motionless, her eyes closed, her spirit fading, a sacrifice offered to the god of light by those who had long forgotten what light truly meant. By the 5th century before Christ, Delphi had become more than a sanctuary, it was the axis of empires. Kings and generals came from every corner of the ancient world to hear Apollo's word. But by then, the god's voice had long since fallen silent. What echoed through the temple was something else, the careful whispers of men who learned to wield prophecy as a weapon. It began, as all horrors do, with belief. When Sparta prepared to march against Persia, its envoys came bearing gold, pleading for divine approval. The priests received them with reverence, yet the oracle was already chosen, her trance rehearsed, her words written before her lips ever parted. In the suffocating chamber of vapors, she would mutter as if in ecstasy, and the priests would emerge to announce Apollo's command, "Go forth, for your victory is assured." But the truth was darker. The priests had been paid by both sides. To the Persians, they delivered the opposite prophecy, warning that Greece's arrogance would bring ruin. What followed was a war built on deceit, a slaughter sanctified by divine lies. The oracle's voice guided both armies toward the same inevitable end, death. When the soldiers fell at Thermopylae, many believed the prophecy had been fulfilled. They called it destiny. Yet Delphi's priests profited from both grief and glory. Offerings poured into the temple, statues were raised in gratitude, and the truth remained buried beneath incense and stone. The oracle's voice had become the perfect disguise for the ambitions of mortals. Some accounts tell of a Pythia who realized the cost of her words. After a prophecy condemned an Athenian general and thousands of his men, she collapsed in the temple courtyard, crying that her visions were not her own. The priests silenced her, declaring that Apollo had withdrawn his spirit from her body. Days later, she vanished. Officially, she was retired. Unofficially, she was never seen again. The prophecy of death was more than a single deception, it was a pattern. Each empire that rose looked to Delphi for approval, and each found a god willing to bless its violence. The priests learned that fear was as profitable as faith. When famine struck, they blamed the people's sins and demanded offerings to restore Apollo's favor. When plague spread, they claimed the god was angry and sold redemption at the price of gold. Death became a business, and prophecy its justification. Through it all, the oracle remained a prisoner of her own sanctity. Every prophecy she uttered brought more death, more praise, more guilt. She was worshipped as divine, yet treated as disposable. When her voice trembled, the priests said the god was angry. When she wept, they said it was the spirit's ecstasy. No one saw the human beneath the veil, only the instrument of fate. In Delphi's marble halls, destiny was written not by gods, but by those who learned to imitate them. The prophecy of death revealed the temple's greatest truth, that belief itself could kill. And still pilgrims came, kneeling before the same altar, praying for salvation from a god who no longer listened. Beneath the splendor of Delphi's marble sanctum, hidden from the pilgrims' eyes, there existed a place the priests never spoke of, a chamber carved into the rock, sealed behind bronze doors, blackened by centuries of incense smoke. It was called by a name whispered only among the temple servants, the Chamber of Silence. It was where the voices that defied Apollo were made to disappear. Few ever saw it and lived to speak of it. Ancient fragments found near the Castellian Spring mention a room beneath the serpents. Breath, a place where the Pythias who broke faith with the god were purified by fire and vapors. The official records call it a purification rite. But those who studied the ruins know better. It was not cleansing. It was punishment. When a Pythia's mind began to fracture, when she questioned the priest's words or refused to enter trance, she was led below. Some went willingly, believing they were being prepared for rebirth. Others screamed and fought as their sacred veils were torn away. The descent was said to take hours through winding tunnels slick with moisture, where the air grew heavier with every step. The torches dimmed as if the god himself disapproved of what awaited. What happened inside remains buried in rumor and ash. Some claim the women were forced to inhale the same toxic vapors that once gave them visions, this time in doses that burned their lungs and minds beyond recovery. Others said they were locked in darkness until their voices failed, their cries mistaken for divine wailing echoing up through the temple floor. There are tales of the priests conducting secret rituals to extract the god's essence from the disobedient, a process described in cryptic inscriptions as unbinding the vessel. Whether this meant exorcism or execution, no one knows. But one thing is certain: no Pythia ever returned from the chamber. Their names were erased from the temple's tablets, their likenesses chipped from the stone. They were made into ghosts, sacrificed not to Apollo, but to silence itself. It was through this chamber that Delphi maintained its perfection. The illusion of divine purity could not survive doubt, nor could the power of prophecy endure a woman who remembered she was human. Each disappearance was explained away as divine selection, Apollo choosing a new voice. Yet beneath the temple, the walls still held the breath of those who had spoken too much. In 1902, an excavation team unearthed a sealed vault near the lower terraces of Delphi. Inside, they found fragments of bronze restraints, scorched ceramic bowls, and human bones, small and delicate, belonging to young women. The findings were quietly documented, then forgotten. The local authorities claimed the remains were from animal sacrifices. But one archaeologist wrote privately that the bones bore marks of confinement, not ritual slaughter. The report was never published. The Forbidden Chamber was not myth, it was the foundation of Delphi's sanctity. Every prophecy, every ritual, every whispered word of the god was built upon that darkness. It was the price of purity, the silence of the corrupted, the erasure of the defiant. And though the temple now lies in ruins, that silence remains unbroken, echoing through time, reminding us that even faith has a dungeon. Among the long line of women who serve the god, one name survives only in whispers: Thea, a Pythia remembered not for her prophecies, but for her defiance. Her existence was nearly erased, her story buried beneath the temple's marble, yet fragments of her truth endured in a handful of ancient accounts. She was the oracle who dared to reveal what Delphi feared most, that the god no longer spoke at all. Thea served during the late 4th century BCE, when Delphi was at its most corrupt. The temple's wealth had reached unimaginable heights. Envoys from every empire offered gold, ivory, and slaves to shape the words of Apollo. But Thea saw what others refused to see. The priests had replaced divine vision with calculated deceit. The sacred fumes were no longer the breath of a god, but the manipulation of men. One winter, when the king of Thessaly sought a prophecy before his invasion of Epirus, the priests prepared the usual spectacle. Thea was led to the tripod, her veins numbed by vapors, her heart pounding from the fumes. The priests expected obedience, but when she opened her mouth, what came out was not the prophecy they had written for her. Her voice trembled, raw and human. You feed upon the faith of nations. You sell the will of Apollo for silver. The god is gone, only lies remain. The words spread like fire. Pilgrims gasped. Priests froze in disbelief. In that instant, the illusion cracked. Thea had shattered centuries of divine authority with a single truth. The punishment was swift and merciless. Officially, she was declared possessed by false spirits and taken to be purified. In Delphi, that meant the chamber below. But the records diverge from there. Some say she was burned alive in the temple's inner sanctum, her ashes mixed into the incense as a warning to others. Others believe she was entombed within the very rock of Parnassus, sealed where no prayer could reach her. Yet her truth refused to die. In secret, temple attendants carved faint symbols. Beneath the stone tiles of the sanctuary, spirals and broken sigils said to represent her last prophecy. Centuries later, a Roman historian wrote of a mad priestess who defied the god and brought silence to Delphi. The silence he spoke of was not madness, but aftermath, the sudden emptiness that followed when faith met truth. After Thea's disappearance, the temple grew quieter. No new Pythia was chosen for nearly a decade. The priests claimed Apollo had withdrawn from the world, but some scholars believe Delphi was simply terrified that Thea's final words had unmasked the system so completely that even the devout began to doubt. In the end, Thea became the ghost that haunted Delphi's sanctity. Her story was forbidden, her name struck from the tablets, yet her defiance lingered like an echo in the mountain wind. The oracle who spoke the truth was silenced, but her silence exposed the temple's greatest fear, that faith built on deceit cannot endure the sound of honesty. By the time Delphi reached its height, the line between the sacred and the profane had been erased. The oracle, once believed to channel Apollo directly, had become a living mask, a figure whose very body symbolized divine perfection while concealing the corruption beneath. Every gesture, every tremor of the Pythia was curated to convince the world that the god himself spoke. Yet, in truth, the power behind those words belonged entirely to men. The priests learned early that perception was stronger than reality. The oracle's voice, distorted by trance and fear, could be molded into any prophecy desired. Her trembling hands were interpreted as sacred inspiration. Her muttered anxieties became divine warning. Pilgrims bowed, kings obeyed, and Delphi's reputation flourished. The god appeared to command obedience, but it was the priests who held the strings. Purity, devotion, and divine possession were carefully orchestrated. The Pythia's every act reinforced the illusion. The laurel crowns, the white robes, the incense that hung thick in the sanctuary. Outsiders saw a woman elevated by divine will, untouched by human frailty. Inside, however, she lived under constant surveillance, her mind and body manipulated to perform a role that had been written for her before she ever entered the temple. The mask of divinity served another purpose: control over kings and armies. Rulers who believed they were guided by Apollo were, in fact, responding to the will of men who had long ago substituted ambition for truth. War, peace, alliances, and betrayals were all filtered through the mouth of a trembling woman whose only crime was obedience. Each prophecy was a performance, and every performance strengthened Delphi's political power. Even the Oracle herself began to internalize the illusion. Isolated and bound by vows, she came to believe in the divine authority she projected, confusing her own fear and exhaustion for spiritual guidance. Her body, trained to appear holy, became a symbol that blinded the world to her suffering. This psychological captivity was perhaps more effective than any physical restraint. The mask she wore was not merely ceremonial, it was her life. The priest's manipulation extended beyond appearances. Records were carefully edited, and transcripts of prophecies altered before being sent to the cities that relied on Delphi's counsel. When errors occurred, the oracle was blamed. The god's voice, they claimed, had been misinterpreted. Few dared question a divine decree, and fewer still considered that the voice might belong entirely to mortal hands. Over time, the mask of divinity became indistinguishable from the oracle herself. Devotion, fear, and obedience fused into a single instrument of control. The sacred and the sinister were inseparable, and Delphi flourished as both temple and theater, hiding its wrought beneath marble columns and golden offerings. The truth, however, lingered beneath the surface. Each Pythia who took the tripod carried the weight of the temple's deception. The mask she wore could inspire awe and terror, but it could not erase the knowledge that she was both prisoner and performance. And in that duality, Delphi revealed its greatest secret. What the world venerates as divine may, in reality, be the reflection of human greed and cruelty, hidden behind the perfect mask of holiness. The arrival of Rome marked the beginning of Delphi's final descent from sanctity to shadow. By the 1st century BCE, the temple's fame had spread across the Mediterranean, but its rituals and manipulations had left it vulnerable to scrutiny. Roman generals and envoys, curious and unafraid, saw beyond the marble columns and laurel crowns. They recognized the oracle not as a divine vessel, but as a tool shaped by human hands. The desecration began subtly. Roman soldiers entered the sanctuary under the pretense of tribute, yet they observed, cataloged, and reported what the Greeks had long taken for granted. The priests, accustomed to unquestioning reverence, were suddenly confronted with eyes that did not bend in awe. They tried to maintain the illusion. The Pythia would tremble, inhale the sacred fumes, and speak in her rehearsed voice. Yet the Romans questioned everything: her silence, her cries, and the inconsistencies in the prophecies that had once commanded entire armies. Accounts suggest that some Roman officers attempted to coerce the oracle into declaring loyalty to the Republic. Her voice, meant to be the instrument of Apollo, now became a test of endurance. According to fragments of Roman letters, the priests struggled to maintain authority. They feared not only the loss of wealth, but the exposure of centuries of carefully concealed cruelty. Delphi's power rested on illusion. Once that illusion was penetrated, the temple itself became vulnerable. Archaeological evidence points to deliberate desecration. Stones were overturned, inscriptions erased, and sacred vessels looted. Some Roman historians describe the removal of the tripod, the laurel crowns, and even the sacred laurel smoke pipes, all intended to demonstrate that the god's voice was not eternal, and that the temple could be controlled by mortal will. Pilgrims fled in fear, witnessing the destruction of what they had once believed unassailable. The Pythia herself suffered in ways both physical and psychological. The carefully maintained routines that had controlled her life were violently disrupted. She was forced into public exposure, her trances observed and mocked, her sanctity violated not by ritual, but by demonstration of power. Those who had once trembled at her words now demanded proof of loyalty to Rome. Delphi's sacred aura, built over centuries, collapsed under scrutiny. Yet even in desecration, the priests clung to power. They tried to convince Romans that the oracle's prophecies were divinely inspired, even as evidence mounted that Delphi's influence was a human construct. They manipulated every word, every tremor, attempting to preserve their status. But Rome would not be fooled. The temple became a cautionary spectacle, a monument to human ambition disguised as divinity, now exposed for all to see. The Romang desecration did more than plunder gold or remove artifacts. It shattered the carefully maintained illusions that had kept the Oracle and her priesthood in control. Delphi's power was not destroyed entirely, but its veneer of invincibility cracked. For the first time in centuries, the world could see the suffering beneath the laurel, the manipulation beneath the hymns, and the human cost of a god who no longer existed. Delphi remained a temple, but its voice had been silenced, its truths laid bare. The god had fled, or perhaps he had never been there. What remained was a cautionary tale of faith exploited, of devotion betrayed, and of human cruelty masked as divinity. By the early 1st century CE, Delphi's marble halls echoed with a silence that had never existed before. The sanctuary, once the world's most revered oracle, had seen centuries of devotion, deception, and manipulation. Yet now its power was waning. The last Pythia, chosen under the shadow of corruption and fear, was tasked with delivering what history would remember as the final prophecy. The ritual proceeded as always. The oracle was anointed, guided to the tripod, and exposed to the suffocating vapors rising from the fissure beneath the temple floor. The priests observed in rigid silence, aware that this prophecy would be their last chance to maintain the illusion of divine authority. Yet, unlike her predecessors, this Pythia had been witness to the temple's unraveling. She had seen the desecration by the Romans, the whispered rebellions of attendants, and the growing skepticism of pilgrims. Her voice carried not just the words of Apollo, but the weight of truth. When she spoke, her words were trembling, fragmented, yet devastatingly clear. She foretold a time when Delphi's influence would vanish, when empires would rise and fall without guidance from the god of prophecy, and when the sanctity of faith could no longer conceal human greed. Every syllable shattered the carefully constructed veil the priests had maintained for centuries. Historians later noted that her prophecy was not concerned with kings or wars, but with the end of an institution itself. The priests were horrified. For centuries, they had rewritten, redirected, and suppressed the oracle's words to suit their ambitions. Now, for the first time, their control slipped entirely. Pilgrims recorded fragments, spreading them beyond the sanctuary's walls. The final prophecy became both a warning and an accusation. Delphi had not served Apollo but had served men, and the god's voice had been silenced long ago by human corruption. The Pythia's delivery was more than a ritual. It was an act of defiance. She spoke as if she had reclaimed her agency, using the last moments of sanctity to expose the temple's sins. The vapors, once instruments of manipulation, could not restrain her. Even as her body trembled violently and her voice faltered, the truth poured forth, leaving the priests powerless. Afterward, the oracle was removed from the tripod, never to be used again. Some accounts suggest she was hidden in secrecy to protect her life. Others imply she disappeared into obscurity, her name erased from official records. Delphi itself continued to function in name, but the aura of divine guidance had vanished. Pilgrims still arrived, yet their faith was tempered with doubt, their reverence shadowed by awareness of deception. The final prophecy marked not just the end of one Pythia's service, but the collapse of a centuries-old system of control. The oracle's voice, once a tool of kings and priests, had become a mirror reflecting humanity's exploitation of faith. In that moment, Delphi's marble columns and gilded halls no longer represented divine authority. They were monuments to ambition and cruelty. And as silence settled over the sanctuary, one truth endured: the god of Delphi had never truly spoken through the oracle. The voice that once guided nations had been human all along, shaped by fear, ambition, and the suffering of the women forced to wear the mask of divinity. By the time Delphi fell into the hands of history, the temple's grandeur had faded into shadows. Columns once gleaming with gold were cracked and dulled. The laurel wreaths lay broken on stone floors slick with moss. The voices of pilgrims and kings had vanished, replaced by wind whistling through the empty halls. Yet beneath the ruins, in chambers carved from the living rock, the true history remained a record of suffering, manipulation, and fear. Archaeologists centuries later uncovered fragments of this hidden past: bones, scorched vessels, and inscriptions erased and rewritten by generations of priests. These silent remnants bore witness to the countless women who had served as oracles, living under vows of obedience and terror, subjected to rituals meant to strip them of body and mind. The truth they carried, the human cost of Delphi's divinity, remained concealed for centuries beneath layers of marble, incense, and myth. Delphi's fall was not sudden. It was the culmination of years of corruption, the exposure of ritual cruelty, and the erosion of faith in a system that had turned human lives into instruments of power. The Romans had looted and mocked, yes, but even before their arrival, the weight of deception had begun to crush the temple from within. The oracle, once the most feared and revered voice in the Greek world, had become a vessel of human ambition, her sacred authority hollowed by manipulation and fear. The chamber beneath the temple, once used to punish defiant priestesses, now lay abandoned. Its air was thick with the memory of those who had vanished without trace. The fissures that had once emitted sacred fumes still exhaled, though no hand awaited to interpret them. Here, the silence was complete, unbroken even by rumor or song. It was a silence not of peace, but of absence, a testimony to the lives consumed in name of faith. Pilgrims still came, drawn by legend rather than belief. They marveled at the ruins, unaware that the true oracle had long since disappeared, along with the rituals, the smoke, and the carefully curated deceptions. Delphi's voice, once capable of guiding nations, now spoke only through echoes in the stone. The god's mouthpiece had been silenced, not by divine wrath, but by human hubris and the inevitable collapse of a system built on suffering. Yet even in decay, Delphi's story persisted. Scholars, poets, and historians pieced together fragments of ritual, scandal, and control, revealing the dark truths hidden beneath the marble and myth. The temple, though silent, remained a monument to the intersection of power, fear, and human cruelty. The silence beneath the ruins spoke louder than any prophecy ever had. It whispered of innocence lost, of lives sacrificed to ambition, and of a god whose voice had been replaced by the hands of men. Delphi, in its decay, became a warning etched into history. It was a reminder that even the most sacred institutions can be corrupted, that faith can be manipulated, and that the suffering of the few is often concealed beneath the praise of the many. The temple no longer spoke. Its silence, however, carried a message far more enduring than any prophecy, that the god of Delphi had long been replaced by human greed. And the price of divinity was measured in the lives of those who could not refuse it.